Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're speaking with Rachael Bradshaw. What's really exciting about this interview is that in addition to being a practicing counselor, Rachael is also a program director for a genetic counseling program. So if you are someone who's thinking about applying either in this cycle or in the near future, this is going to be a really great video for you because we do delve into some more admissions related questions about genetic counseling programs, and I think you're going to get a lot out of it. So enjoy.
All right, so just to start off the video, would you mind giving us a little introduction of who you are?
Yeah, so my name is Rachael Bradshaw. I'm a genetic counselor in St. Louis. I have sort of two roles. I work as a fetal care counselor at the Fetal Care Institute at Cardinal Brennan Children's Hospital, and then I also work as the program director for the new program in genetic counseling at Washington University in St. Louis.
Awesome. And so the next question I have, I guess, kind of transitions more to your experience as becoming a genetic counselor and getting into your career. What led you to choose the genetic counseling program that you ended up choosing?
It's a different time. There were far fewer programs when I applied. I graduated in 2004, so this was early 2000s, and I was living in St. Louis at the time and had decided that I wanted to pursue this career and was kind of focused on the Midwest. I'm from Indiana. I had met my, at that time, fiance, now husband, in St. Louis, and we sort of wanted to stay somewhere around there. So I was mostly geographically focused. So I applied to programs kind of in Ohio and Indiana primarily. When I interviewed at University of Cincinnati, it was just by far my favorite experience. So I was really happy to be able to accept the offer there.
That's really exciting. I've been looking into that program as well. It seems like it's a really good one. And I guess my next question, since you said you have kind of two different roles in your career right now, would you be able to walk us through what a typical day looks like for you? Maybe that would take kind of two different answers, but.
Yeah, so as far as my clinical site, so I spend 40% of my time in clinic. So I have 2 clinic days a week at the Fetal Care Institute, or I'll probably just say FCI from now on, because that's what we tend to call it. And so that is a multidisciplinary clinic. It's housed in the Children's Hospital, but we have sort of the bridge between the prenatal and the pediatric side there. So we kind of consider it like a concierge service. So the patients come and they sit in this nice nesting room with, lots of space for their support people to come, as well as consultants, and then we kind of come to them. So we go into the room and talk to them. So for me, when I'm working at FCI, it's sort of I know who I'm going to see that day, but I really have no idea what time I'm going to see them, because some of our consultants, we may have like cardiac surgeons coming down to talk to our patients, and their schedules are much less flexible than mine. And so I kind of get in when the timing makes sense to see them. And otherwise, they're there getting ultrasounds, talking to lots of other people, and getting information. Sometimes we're doing sort of group meetings with patients if we have a complex case that kind of needs input from everybody all at once, to make sure we're getting consistent messages, and that we're kind of all saying the same thing that the patients need to hear, and that we're able to consult together. So my day there is sort of unpredictable. I guess it's, I'm typically there from, a little before 8 till around 5 or so. But as far as how many patients I see or when I see them, it's kind of up in the air. And then otherwise, I'm, just kind of prepping for those upcoming patients, keeping up with the team to find out what's going on. So getting updates from the physician after the ultrasound is complete. Are there any new findings, anything I need to know before I go in and talk to them? And yeah, that's pretty much how my day is there. As far as how my day is on the program direction side, that's very different. Our students haven't started yet, so right now it's just a lot of kind of being in the office and dealing with logistics, getting lectures together, figuring out all those little tiny administrative things that need to happen to get students into a brand new program. So we just moved into our space, so we're kind of getting all of our AV stuff set up. So it's a lot of it's less interesting, but it's exciting because it's moving towards something important.
That's really exciting. You said you're setting up all your new stuff for the new cohort. So you guys are going to have an in-person program again. Is that what it sounds like? Okay, that's great.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Yeah, hopefully. So you mentioned about the Fetal Care Institute. I guess, can you speak a little bit about what led you to go down the path of the specialization you chose, which I guess would be like a prenatal kind of specialization?
Yeah, I mean, when I graduated, it was, again, a different time. There weren't as many jobs out there as there are now. So I knew that we wanted to end up back in St. Louis, and I think I probably would have taken any job that was open in St. Louis when I graduated. In retrospect, I think probably cancer or prenatal were sort of the best fits for me, but if pediatrics is just not really my thing, but if it had been open, I'm sure I would have taken it if it was what was available. So in the end, I think pediatrics is a great fit for me. So I've always been, did I say pediatrics? Sorry, prenatal. I've always been a prenatal counselor. And I spent the first kind of half of my career just doing general prenatal. So, just seeing general referrals, and then moved over to this role where I was doing more fetal care. And that's really my favorite thing as far as clinic goes. Fetal care, specifically involves taking care of known pregnancies that have known anomalies. So it may be that we know that the fetus has a diagnosis like Down syndrome or trisomy 18, or it may just be that they have a birth defect or a collection of birth defects, and we maybe haven't figured out why, if there is a genetic component or not. And so to me, it's really rewarding to be part of that part of a patient's journey where, of course, everybody goes into a pregnancy expecting things to go well and expecting, to have a healthy baby at the end. And it's, sad and unfortunate that so many people do face this kind of information, but to be able to help them on that path is really rewarding, and to be able to work as part of a multidisciplinary team. These are often really complex cases, planning for the delivery, who needs to be there, where it needs to happen, how it needs to happen, what we need to be ready to do after the baby's born, takes a lot of different voices at the table. And so it's really an interesting place to work, where we're getting input from pediatric surgeons, we're getting input from the social worker, we're getting input from our palliative care team, we're getting input from the maternal fetal medicine specialist. Obviously, genetics has a voice at the table, and it's just it's a really interesting place to work.
That sounds really, really great. You reminded me. I'm kind of curious with the prenatal specialty. The notion that I have about that is that perhaps with the testing we have available now and just the more information and knowledge we have about all these kinds of things, are there steps you can take when you do find out something, or you have a diagnosis or a positive result from a consultation with a patient? Are there steps you guys plan to take, or even if you have to work with other medical disciplines in order to maybe mitigate some of the problems that arise, or anything like that going forward?
Yeah, so part of fetal care comes down to, in some cases there are fetal interventions or fetal surgeries that can be done. So, a kind of a classic example would be spina bifida. That, in the last decade or so, there's been much, they did a really extensive trial called the MOMS trial to sort of look at the outcomes of fetuses that had prenatal surgery versus those that had the standard surgery after birth. And the data showed that there were definitely a subset of fetuses with spina bifida that did actually benefit from having fetal surgery. And so, you can't entirely fix the problem, but you can mitigate some of the sort of downstream effects of the initial birth defect, sort of the damage that is racked up through pregnancy, with that spina bifida remaining open, versus if you're able to go in a little more than halfway through the pregnancy and close it up, some of those babies do seem to do better. And so, yeah, part of our consultative service is identifying pregnancies that may be good candidates for some kind of fetal intervention or surgery, and making appropriate referrals, making sure that families understand the pros and cons. These are challenging cases because talking to a mom who has found out that her baby has spina bifida about potentially having a fetal surgery. Moms tend to want to do everything they can for their baby, and so they would see that as sort of being the best mom they could be would be to have a surgery like that performed. But there's a lot more that goes into it. There's a lot of risks to mom and baby, and so there's a lot of careful discussion that has to happen so that families can really make the right choices for themselves.
Okay, I definitely understand. It seems like, even though it's possible, which is really great, there's definitely a lot of heavy considerations to be had when you're having those discussions. But that's something that really excites me about that specialty, I think. And I guess the career in general is that as we're moving forward, maybe there are more things we can do to intervene and mitigate these consequences as much as possible. So that's very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So within the rights of patient privacy and everything, I'm curious if you can talk about a case you had or witnessed that really stuck out to you as a really memorable case, and maybe it taught you a very important lesson, or for one reason or another just stuck out to you a lot.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely several. I often tell people that some of the most sort of memorable cases I've had and some of the most grateful patients that our center has ever seen are sometimes the ones that have the worst outcomes, because we didn't make the outcome bad. Obviously, if the baby has a life-limiting condition, that's not fixable, at least currently. We would hope that's sort of the goal. That would be the best possible thing, is if we could cure all these anomalies, cure all these diseases, but we can't. So being able to help families through those times are, again, often the ones that we hear back from who really are so grateful. And, on our end, we feel like it's a privilege to be able to be involved in those cases. And so I can think of several cases like that where, we were involved with families who were aware that their baby had some serious concerns or even had a known diagnosis, and we couldn't change that, but we could change their experience. We could make sure that their desires for what would happen for their baby at birth are honored. Who do they want there? Do they want a photographer? Do they want to, what kind of memories do they want to make? What kind of memories do they want to make with their baby while they're still pregnant? What can we do to make sure they have the right information to make good decisions for themselves about interventions they may or may not want attempted for their baby? So yeah, I think those are the cases that probably stick out to me the most. And I can think of families who I was able to follow, long after they delivered their baby. Sometimes we see families who have really complex cases that we know there's a genetic diagnosis, but we can't figure it out during the pregnancy, and we kind of follow them for years afterwards. And I can think of one mom that I first met when she was, I think, 10 weeks pregnant, and I was with her the day that we finally got a diagnosis for her son, and that was, he was a couple years old at that point, and then was with her. Unfortunately, he passed away, and when they were getting ready to redirect his care, I went to visit them and saw them before he passed away. So really being part of that entire cycle of life was, I would never ever forget that family.
That's really special. I definitely see how following along a family like that, it would be, really, really rewarding. And I guess, is that something that's somewhat common for you in prenatal, if you maybe start out seeing them during a pregnancy, and then obviously if they're coming to you, there is some kind of concern, so maybe that's something you could follow up with and continue to provide care for?
I think it really depends on the sort of the model of sort of where prenatal counselors are employed. So at St. Louis University, where I provide my clinical care, we're all employed out of the pediatrics department. And so my boss is a pediatric geneticist, who's the head of our division. And so that makes it a little bit easier to follow them because, one, I am working at the children's hospital. So if a baby is in the NICU or is coming back for a peds genetics visit, it would be much easier for me to be there than, say, in a setting where the prenatal counselors are all at an obstetric hospital that isn't where pediatric care is provided, or if a prenatal counselor is employed out of the OBGYN department, that connection between pediatrics and prenatal may be a little bit harder to work through. I think it's nice when it's possible, because it is, for families too, they've already met me, and so not having to share their whole story again, not having to start off, brand new with somebody is nice for them, just that continuity of care kind of thing. So I think it's something that some prenatal counselors are able to do. I think in general, a lot of prenatal counselors don't have that ability, but I think all of us on the prenatal side, and the times when I was less connected to pediatrics, I always felt like there was this big black box, like, well, what happened after the baby was born? We had all these thoughts about what we thought was going on, but what really happened, and sometimes it's harder to get that information depending on how that connection is.
Okay, I guess that is just a normal part of, you might not always be able to get that closure, but it is really special that you guys have the opportunity to do that once in a while. That's great. The next question I had for you would be, maybe it's a little hard to pinpoint one thing, but what would you say is the most rewarding part of being a gender counselor?
I think just the amount of time that we're sometimes able to spend with families. I've frequently ended a session with a patient and had them say, nobody's ever spent that much time in a healthcare setting talking to me, asking me questions, making sure I understood what was going on, making sure that my voice was heard. So I think just that unique ability to, the science is cool, I love genetics, but to be able to make that really tangible and usable for patients, and to make sure that we just being able to treat the patient like a whole person and kind of understand them more than just their fetus's diagnosis or a lab result that's sitting in front of you, I think is what's really rewarding. It's those connections, and again, if you have the opportunity to do that kind of longer term follow-up, or to really continue with them as they continue in their journey past their visit with you, I think those are probably the most rewarding things.
Yeah, that's so great. I know, I guess like a cliche thing about genetic counseling is, science and people, and I wanted to combine those, but it is really great to hear from genetic counselors like yourself, an affirmation that that's actually a really true thing that continues to pay dividends and be valuable to you. So that's really great to hear. I'm excited about that.
Yeah.
I guess on the flip side, is there anything you have experienced with your career that might be, the most difficult or challenging part of being a genetic counselor?
I mean, there's probably two sort of sides to that question. Difficult, giving bad news, being with patients who are in pain or trauma, having to be in those really difficult settings is hard, still rewarding. So it's definitely, I wouldn't want to say it's my favorite part, but it's something that I feel privileged to be a part of. As far as like things that I don't really like, I mean, it's probably a really cliche answer. You probably will hear this from most people you talk to, but it's really dealing with like insurance companies, having to get prior authorizations for tests, getting tests that's totally indicated denied. The worst situation would be, in my world, would be times where there's indicated testing on a baby that we knew was going to pass away or did pass away that we couldn't get funding for, and the family couldn't afford to pay for it themselves, and so they've lost this baby. They don't know why. They can't get answers. They can't afford to get answers. Is probably the worst thing. I mean, because of that, one of the neonatologists I work with, he and I kind of wrote up a grant request, and we were able to get a pool of funds to pay for those situations when we do have those babies that we need to get answers on that insurance won't pay for. But I wish we didn't have to do that at all. I wish patients could get indicated testing to get answers they want.
Yeah, that is really sad. I mean, that's really great that you guys started that grant. That's a really good idea, and I'm sure they are so appreciative of that. But do you have any indication? I mean, I have heard that sentiment about insurance quite a lot, but do you know if there's like any indication that things are moving in a better direction with the way insurance is like perceiving genetic counseling?
Yeah, I think it is. Definitely, I've seen things improve over the course of my career, and as licensure comes through in more states, and as more genetic counselors are credentialed with insurance companies, and we're seeing insurance companies now sometimes require that genetic counseling is performed before testing can be done, which is in many cases great, because it makes sure that patients are getting testing that's indicated, not getting testing that's not indicated, and that they're really getting an informed consent process before doing any testing. So yeah, I think it's going in a better direction. I think we still have a long way to go, but I'm hopeful that we'll continue to trend towards seeing, higher reimbursement for counseling services, for genetic testing.
All right, that's reassuring at least. I guess because if you've been able to observe that over the scope of your career, that's a good sign, because I obviously have not been around this too long. So, all right. If you don't mind, I think it would be nice to transition to maybe some of those admissions related questions.
Sure.
The first of which being, as from your perspective, what do you think would make a really good personal statement? Like things people could include, or I guess trends you've seen of really good ones that stand out?
Yeah, so I always say the personal statement should not just be a regurgitation of what's on your CV or your resume. I think most programs probably ask for both from applicants, and so what I don't necessarily want to see someone say, and then when I was a sophomore, I did this, and then when I was a junior, I did this, because I can see all that by looking at their CV, their resume. So one thing I really would like is for applicants to really pick out what are the really important experiences that they've had, and they probably are listed on their CV, but pick out those ones that were really transformative, or really solidified for that applicant that they wanted to pursue this career. What are their unique skills that they were able to put into that experience that made it so successful or transformative, and then what did they get out of it, and how can they translate that to what's going to make them so good, not only as a genetic counseling graduate student, but as a future genetic counselor. So it's I was talking about kind of thinking about pulling these threads through. So what did you do? Why were you good at it? What did it mean to you? And where is it taking you? Ultimately, the personal statement is really a place where an applicant should be able to tell us that they truly understand what genetic counseling is, and that they have some very unique skills that will make them good at it, and that they have some kind of ability to think critically about where they can take that. I think a lot of times personal statement prompts will ask applicants to say, how do you envision your future career? And that isn't necessarily saying, I know I want to be a cancer counselor in Topeka, Kansas. It doesn't have to be that, but maybe, more specifically, what areas of genetic counseling are really exciting to that applicant? Are they really interested in doing public health education? Are they really interested in just like definite day-to-day clinical patient-facing, services? Are they really excited about working with a lab and developing new tests? Where do they see themselves? So it takes a little critical thinking, and you can kind of tell those applicants who've really thought about that, all of those questions, and are able to kind of tie those threads through.
Okay, yeah, that's really good advice. So do you think maybe if someone has an idea of a specialization they're interested in for a particular reason, or, some kind of, I guess you're saying, directions they want to take their career, those are all things that would be good to include?
Yeah, especially if the prompt asks for it. I mean, I know everybody's prompts are different. So I know that's hard on applicants if they're applying to, 5, 10 more programs, to have all these different versions of this personal statement floating around. I think if the prompt doesn't ask it, don't answer questions they don't ask, because you've really limited real estate usually. That we usually tend to give applicants a certain word count or page count or something, and so you don't want to include things that they're not asking for. I think programs themselves all decide. I can say from our standpoint, when we sat down to think about how we were going to go through our application review process, our admissions committee kind of defined what we thought were the most important characteristics that we would value. And many of them are probably very similar to other programs, but there are probably some differences. There are programs that may be much more focused on research, on bench science, on, a proven high level of academic success, really intense experiences with psychosocial counseling. And so, there will be those nuances. And I think you can kind of, if you really look at the prompts that a program is giving you for their personal statement, you can probably tease out the things that they value the most and that are going to determine who's going to be most successful in the application process of that program.
Okay, that definitely makes sense. I've noticed so far there are nuanced differences in the different personal statement, requirements or the way that they write their prompts. So I'm sure that would definitely come in handy to tailor them a little bit to each one.
Mm-hmm.
And you also reminded me when you were speaking about the regurgitation of the resume or the CV. I've heard of that before and definitely realized that's like not the best way to go about it. So, but do you think that when you speak about one or two experiences that were very transformative, or I guess they would tend to be something that is already on your resume, but do you think that's something that necessarily needs to be on your resume, or could, to completely avoid reiterating your resume experience, something in your personal statement could be an experience that is actually not even included on your resume because maybe it's not like an experience that's totally academic or volunteer based or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think, people certainly bring up personal experiences they've had with a relative who was, working through the healthcare system, who maybe had some kind of diagnosis, whether it was genetic or not, that may have really inspired them to pursue a career in healthcare. So I think those are certainly, there's no way to list that on your resume, like grandpa had cancer. That's not, you're not going to put that on your resume. So I think that absolutely some of those experiences wouldn't go on your resume. But, I'm always kind of, it's perplexing to me sometimes when I'm looking at an applicant who may list that they've done like 80 hours of shadowing, which is a lot of shadowing, and somebody would be very lucky if they had that much shadowing, right? But if somebody lists this extensive shadowing experience and then they don't really talk at all about anything that they experienced in the shadowing setting, we don't require shadowing. I don't think that most programs do. I think it's problematic to require shadowing of applicants because it's hard to come by. Even pre-pandemic was hard to come by. And it's also, from sort of a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint, not everybody has access to a genetic counselor they can shadow. They may not live close to one. They may not be able to take a day off of work unpaid to travel somewhere. And there's lots of logistical reasons why shadowing may not be accessible to people. But if somebody has had that experience and they don't share anything about, I don't expect them to, violate any kind of HIPAA laws with that, but just say sometimes they'll give vague statements like, I was really interested in how the counselor was able to explain complex things. Tell me more. What was interesting to you? Or I'm always kind of looking for more. So if somebody has some experiences like that on their CV or their resume and they don't tell me anything about them in their personal statement, I'm always a little like, that's weird, because that would have been, I think, a place where they could really pull some meat out that would tell me, again, those things that I'm really interested in.
All right, that's a really good point. That clarifies it a lot. So maybe at least if you're not regurgitating your resume, maybe it should be reflective of the things you have on there in terms of especially how much time you committed to it. That's a great point.
Yeah.
So another question I have, which maybe I'm sure it's different from when you were going through your program, but in terms of interviews, how those typically go. I know you can obviously speak to your current program that you're directing right now, but I guess, is that something that is extremely variable among programs, or is it kind of a consistent thing?
I think there's probably a lot of commonalities. This is our first cohort coming in this in 3 weeks. They're coming, so we only have one admission cycle that I can specifically speak to, and then I can speak to my own experience interviewing many years ago. Obviously the last admission cycle was a weird one because we were in the middle of a pandemic, as we still are, and we couldn't do in-person interviews. I think, we did poll our interviewees afterwards and ask them if they would prefer in-person or virtual, and by far most people would have preferred in-person. But I think a lot of us are asking, not just our program, but other program directors are kind of wondering if we shouldn't maintain some option for virtual interviews. Again, coming back to that accessibility, equity, inclusion, sort of foundation that's so important. Not everybody has the money to travel to interview at multiple programs across the country. So, I think that it's harder for students to get an idea of who you are if they're not with you and if they don't get to physically see the facilities, the hospital. Meeting current students, I think, is really valuable. It was certainly really valuable to me as an applicant. That was probably one of the most sort of helpful things for me to figure out where I wanted to go, was talking to the current students, just hearing what they said about their experiences and how they interacted with each other. So I think that's, there's ways to do that. You can have times where your applicants get to Zoom separately with your current students without faculty on, so that there's a little bit more, nobody's watching, but it's not the same. So, I think we're hopeful that we could do in-person interviews next year, this cycle. So that would be like, late winter, early spring of 2022. We're hopeful that would be possible. We still have no idea how things are going to look, obviously. But, for me, what we kind of looked at with what was important for us in the interview process was, again, I don't really want the applicant to regurgitate to me what they've already told me in their CV or their personal statement. So I may not necessarily want to ask them questions like, okay, what do you think genetic counseling is? Because I already asked that in the personal statement prompt. Obviously, they answered it pretty well, or they wouldn't be getting into the interview stage. So we're really more interested in the interview stage of looking at kind of non-quantifiable characteristics that make students, that data has shown can make students successful in graduate school. And so that's kind of the things we're looking at is, how do people handle stress? How do they handle conflict? How do they, what are their, how have they interacted with people from diverse backgrounds? Some of those things that you can't really get at until you really talk to somebody. So that's kind of, for us, what the interview process is for.
Okay, that definitely makes sense. How obviously, if you got that far to an interview, you've pretty much been vetted for your your worthiness of becoming a genetic counseling student. You're definitely have the credentials to be there. But I guess I've heard I'm not sure where I heard it from or which programs it might have been, but different ways to see how you do maybe like problem solving, critical thinking, and interacting with. Do they normally interact with other applicants for that program?
Yeah, it was really hard for us to figure out a way to make that work over Zoom. I know there are ways that other programs have done that with doing group interviews to kind of see how, I know I talked to one program director who said it was really interesting to have maybe more than one applicant in front of them and asking a question and just kind of seeing who's the person who always talks first. Who's the person who always listens, who's the person who's not really talking at all, to kind of get an idea of what that might be like. And it doesn't mean that the person who talks first isn't a good candidate or the person who's not talking at all isn't a good candidate, but it might give you an idea of how they would function as a cohort together in classes, a lot of which require a lot of participation. So I think there are ways to do it. Since this was our first cycle, we were kind of like, we're going to do the things that we know we need to do, and then we'll kind of work through the tweaks that we can do down the road.
Okay, that definitely makes sense. I'm sure you'll be figuring it out more and more now as we transition back to normalcy and everything like that. But I guess I have another question that's kind of related to the resume again, which would be, I've understood it to be, aside from academic experience and volunteering, there could be a good portion of your resume devoted to genetic counseling exposure. And I'm wondering what you would consider appropriate to include in that portion, like what scope of material would actually be relevant enough to include.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell when I talk to applicants, I always tell them, make sure you let us know what you've done because you can't get credit for things if you don't tell us. So if you've participated in like a virtual case conference, I've talked to applicants after the admission cycle was over who weren't successful. They were kind of looking for advice of how to be more successful next time. And they might share with me, yeah, I had done this, and I was like, well, that wasn't anywhere on your application, so I had no idea that you had that. So I think, I also don't necessarily want to know every sorority or fraternity car wash that somebody, helped plan, and that's great, but maybe summarizing things that kind of go under one umbrella, like organizing fundraising activities for my sorority or fraternity as opposed to listing them all separately. Think about it. It's not a place to list everything you ever did. And after a while, if you kind of list everything very singularly, it starts to look like, kind of like grade grubbing. Like, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and maybe I can get a half point here. So that's not the place to do that. But then thinking about, I think, especially in the genetic counseling exposure area, and then in any kind of like volunteer or crisis intervention, really thinking what are the truly individual experiences that you've had that have been additive in your journey towards becoming, hopefully becoming a genetic counselor. So if people have, if people listen to a podcast, I don't want to see every single episode of a podcast they listen to, but if they want to list that separately under some kind of heading like, media, if they've read some books, if they want to list some of those things, I think that's fine. I probably don't want a list of every book they ever read or every movie they ever watched, but if there are things that they truly think were additive that you think are valuable, I would list them there. If somebody has shadowing experience, listing, I think hours is helpful. It's different to say I was there 4 hours one day, or I was able to do 6 weeks of shadowing over the summer. Just helps us know what kind of experience they may have had, and maybe listing what specialties they may have observed. If people are doing informational interviews, listing each counselor they interviewed and maybe what their specialty is. Because if I see that somebody has talked to 3 or 4 counselors who have different roles, that gives me some idea of maybe the breadth of their understanding of the career and the different paths people can take. So I think it's a fine line between listing too much and not listing enough. I think, really thinking about, do you think this experience, whether it was in high school, college, or, outside of that, is really important for this program to know to understand you and why you're such a great applicant, or are you just listing it because you want one more bullet point on your resume to make it a little bit longer,
Yeah, absolutely. That's really good advice. I think that is really helpful going forward. I think I've pretty much been following that, those ideas so far, which is nice to know. But yeah, it's definitely great advice. Well, I think those are all the questions I had for you today, but I really do appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, and it's been super helpful.
Yeah, it was nice talking to you too.
All right, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
All right, once again, that was Rachael Bradshaw. I'm going to try to focus on these admissions-related questions every time I can, because I think they were very helpful for my own learning, and I'm sure they'll help anyone else who's thinking of applying soon to a genetic counseling program. Having those insights, especially from someone in a position like Rachel's, is definitely really, really helpful, and I really appreciate her giving some of those insights on this video, because it's not every day that you can get those kind of inside scoops on what exactly you should be doing to best prepare yourself for a program. So stay posted for more videos to come, and have a good one.